Hi there, everyone. This is the next installment here in our series of remote lectures for Global Politics, Government 219. As advertised in the syllabus, this is going to be the lecture. This is going to be one of at least two lectures. We'll see how things wrap up after that, about maybe having a third. But at least the next two lectures are, well, this lecture and the one after are on theories of international relations. And the first one we're going to do is realism. You had a lot of reading that was due from the textbook on realism, so you should have a pretty good grasp of it. I'm going to go back and do my clean run-through of how I explain realism without reference to the readings. It doesn't mean that it doesn't cover stuff in the readings. On the contrary, it's supposed to overlap quite a bit. But this is my explanation, and I want you to be checking it against your explanation, your understanding of how realism works based on the readings you had in the textbook. So, as I tend to do with all these lectures, if you are not caught up, pause the video, go get caught up with the readings and the previous lectures, and then come back to this. If you are all caught up, then make sure this sounds right. So what you can see right now on your screens is an outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm not going to give you the notes. You need to fill these in on your own. For those of you who have had me in the past, either remotely or back in the physical classrooms, you know that there's a good bit of cumulative knowledge here. You need to know this stuff to know other stuff, and you need to know this stuff for quizzes and for exams, and it's helpful to do it now, to take notes as you go along, rather than going through this lecture, getting a quiz on it at the end of this week or beginning of next week, then having to have to come back to this and listen through it again, get the notes you need for the quiz, then maybe having something from it on exam 1, having to have to come back to it, listen through it again. Like, that's just so much more work. I mean, it's great to reinforce it, but I want to. This is already a lot of work. I don't want it to be more work than it needs to be. So here we go with our first theory of how global politics works. And I'll mention that this, as well as the lecture on liberalism, really it is realism and liberalism that are the two main theories of global politics today. And you know, among most academics, those who have PhDs in international relations, political science, and above, there are fewer realists today than there are subscribers to liberalism or some kind of it, and there are a host of smaller theories. But we're going to start with realism. It's one of the older ones, and it's probably the easiest to understand. So we are off here with the theory of realism, and as you're going to learn a little bit, of course, there are different strands of realism, like there are different strands of liberalism. But I'm starting off by talking about the points that are generally common to all realists. And here they are. The points should speak for themselves, but you need to fill in the blanks with your own notes. So I do preface this by saying, realists, like liberals, like constructivists, like followers of the English school and other theories, our subject matter is global politics. And so we wrestle with theories of global politics. That is, how is it that different actors get different things, who gets what, when, and how at the international level. It's not a theory of foreign policy. Realism doesn't try to explain a given country. You know, why did Indonesia not sign a particular trade agreement? Or why is it unexpectedly adhering to human rights conventions, which might seem to contradict some national interest? Realism and no other theory of IR is pretending to be a good explanation of every single policy decision that a country makes. What the theories are trying to explain, is to say generally, this is how global politics works, and it tries to explain quite a bit of history. I'm talking about, in some cases, hundreds of years. Other times the periods of analysis are a bit smaller, maybe looking at the Cold War, say, rather than a couple hundred years. But they're trying to explain, broad strokes, what are we seeing at the international level and why. And so realists have their reasons, their explanations for why we're seeing what we are. Liberals have theirs, and other theories have theirs. So keep that in mind. As I talk through what realists predict, if you're sitting there and you're kind of pinging these down one after the other, and you're like, oh, I can find an exception to that, I can find an exception to that, just relax. None of these theories are perfect. The issue is always which one does better than others. So, what does it argue? This point usually gets obscured in introductions to realism, and it kind of gets placed a little bit lower down in the scheme of things. But I think that this is actually the starting point, which is for discussing global politics. Why we see what we do is best explained by power, according to realists. And it is military power at that is the most important. It's not the only manner in which power demonstrates itself. Realists also refer to what's sometimes known as latent power, or we would probably say economic power, which is of secondary importance, but it's just that it's secondary importance. And for realists, in the conflict for who gets what, when, and how globally, military power is frequently going to shape the results of those disputes, or at least the threat of using that military force. They think does a pretty good job explaining why states do what they do. You don't have to agree with any of this. You just need to be able to understand it, to follow it. This next point is that what we call states are the most powerful actors in the global system. So very quickly, I'll just remind you of this map that I've had up in the back for some time. There's no requirement that states be the political units that are the most powerful. If you're familiar with some of the history from antiquity, so on, you know that empires have frequently been a way of organizing politics and providing for some level of order over very large distances. That could hold true. For most realists, empires obviously don't really exist anymore, at least not formal empires over large swaths of land. There are some large countries you can see on the map: Russia, China, United States. Canada is kind of one of those exceptional countries that has a lot of territory, not necessarily a great power. It is not a great power. But states today, and all the elements of statehood I talked about in the previous lecture, those political organizations are the most powerful actors that are out there. When realists look to the other kind of actors in global politics, whether they be non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, some of the armed non-state actors that are out there, IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, the UN, European Union, African Union, and so forth, they indeed try to compete for influence against states, but for realists, they just don't have very much power at all, because for realists it's going to be military power that determines the outcome of conflicts. When one side or one group wants something, another group wants the same thing, and there's competition over it, push comes to shove, and this ends up being a war. The side with greater military force usually ends up winning. And while there are some multinational corporations that have private security functions, well, IGOs may be able to beg, borrow. I don't think they can steal yet from states' forces, say, for peacekeeping operations. Those are just so inconsiderable when you compare them to first, second, third-rate militaries even. And those are all held by states. In the future, maybe it'll be something different. Right? There are all sorts of dystopian sci-fi predictions about the future, and if you also project back to the past, you know that there were examples of privatized military forces. For example, you had some interesting examples of the British East India Company, which was a company, and yet it ruled many parts of India and carried out government-like functions. You had the Congo Free State in sub-Saharan Africa. That was Belgium. And so these kind of things do exist, but today, right now, we don't have too much of that. Most military forces is held by state militaries, and it tends to be a relatively small number of powers that have the preeminent and secondary militaries. All right, this next point is either very confusing or not at all confusing. And because this is a recording, I really don't know. But this is the point I'm talking about. It's highlighted. It should show up for you as well. And this comment is made, this observation about realism is also repeated in the Minx, Toft, and the rest textbook, which is that states are unitary and rational actors. The rationally part, you can see I actually have a separate discussion for that. Unitary, I don't know if it's the word or if people think the word is supposed to mean more than it is. The idea of a unitary state is simply that there is a group of decision makers within a state, within a government, and once they have made a decision, that is the decision that the state carries out. That it follows through government from start to finish. What is intended is done. It's set up as a kind of contrast to liberalism. And the liberal view of the state is that you have all of these competing, almost interest groups. And they're competing against one another. And if they lose, say, the policy battle in the legislature and in the executive, they can still try to overcome that decision elsewhere if they're well organized to obstruct policy, right? Foreign policy, we're talking about global politics, if they're able to. Realists don't think that that's a very good explanation for how policy actually works, and that once states make a decision, they have sufficient strength to implement those decisions over the objection, perhaps, of groups who are opposed. So unitary decision making just tells us that state leaders make a decision, and then that is the decision that is followed. If you can remember that, that's the only takeaway you need at this point. Rational actors. All right. So this is the second half of the point that's highlighted, and it also relates to the point below it. It is a bit more fun to do this live and ask people to come up with their definition of rationality. What is it? And some are better than others, but frequently I hear people define rationality in ways that you can't really measure if it's happening or not, and that's okay. As it relates to global politics, in realists' view of rationality, it refers to the ability of state leaders, right? Because states are inanimate objects, but state leaders to be able to look at, say, a foreign policy problem before them, to evaluate different courses of action, and then to select the policy that gives them the greatest reward at the least cost. To them, that's rational decision making. Now, I'll draw an analogy to something. It may not apply to many of you if you haven't taken it. But that definition of rationality is not all that different than, say, particularly in microeconomics, but more generally in economics, the belief in rational decision making of economic actors, whether they be households or companies, that they can figure out, all right, we have this amount of resources and this is what we need to do. Here are the ways we can do it. What is the most efficient way to do it? Because in the economic example, your resources are never, they may be considerable, but they're not without limit. And so how to get the most out of those scarce resources, because they're not super abundant, is a problem for economics. Well, similarly in global politics, states have a certain amount of power. Now, what they want to do with it, that's actually kind of a point of a debate, whether they're pursuing security or power, whether those things are necessarily interchangeable. Some realists think that those two things are one and the same. Others are not quite so sure. But for our purposes and for the introduction, the overview of realism, basically, is that states will choose the policies that give them the greatest benefit at the least cost. And realists are quick to point out, now if you can think of bad foreign policies, like foreign policy failure, their defenses are twofold. First, they're going to go back to the first note in here, which is that they're not trying to explain every country's foreign policy at every time. But their other point is that there's no rule that requires states to behave rationally. Their argument, well, one of their arguments is that the international system forces states to either be rational decision makers, or there's a good chance that they might go under, that they might be selected out of the system, or that they'll fall from great power status to lesser power status. And so here on this second point, I'm going to interject something between the margins of states tend to behave rationally and not all interests are equally important. And I'll bring up this point that a lot of analyses of realism begin with, which is that the international system, and we'll go back to our Google map here, our international system is anarchic. And I told you in the previous lecture that this would be coming to you. And here it is, it's arrived. And that anarchy doesn't necessarily mean chaos, in the sense that, every country is burning and, everything is terrible. I mean, right now it seems like things are terrible. But just because things are anarchic at the national level, at the international level, does not mean that they're anarchic at the national level and below. That there is order. But when it comes to the relationships between countries, there is no authority higher than a state that can compel states to behave in certain ways. Right? There's the UN, the United Nations, doesn't have that kind of power. As you'll see when we get to that, there are a number of intentional structural flaws built into the United Nations to make sure that it never has much power and independence. And so as a result, as realists like to point out, international organizations such as the UN tend not to control the power of their members, but they tend to reflect it. And that the balance of power globally is frequently recreated inside of these international organizations, at least an approximation of what's going on globally. So there is no government above the level of national governments. That's all the anarchy that there is. And as a result, states have to look to themselves for their own defense. Again, to do otherwise, it may work. So states may cling together in the belief that those states will always have one another's back, or that some major ally will always be there to defend them. And the point that realists make is that you can do that, but the one time you're wrong might be the last time you're able to be wrong. Because it may mean defeat, may mean you're conquered, you're carved up, your state is destroyed, and you're consumed by larger states. So realists don't say that every single state's leaders behave rationally all the time. Their argument is that the system forces them to think and act rationally. If they don't, they're risking their own destruction, and that over time, irrational leaderships and irrational leaders are selected out of the system because they don't use their power efficiently. And just to give you an example of that, right? For whatever reason in global politics, people always tend to gravitate towards like the extreme example, but I'll indulge them, maybe you, by going to an extreme example of irrationality, which is Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Now, there was a country with great power potential. Certainly, Hitler and those around him wanted to see Germany restored to a first-tier power level, and we'll talk in detail about how that happened and why they perceived that hadn't happened when we get to the history of global politics in the modern era. But Hitler engages in a number of conflicts, some of which were less risky than others. The war with Poland worked because the Soviet Union, then existed at the time, agreed to the joint invasion and carving up of Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. That was not irrational, provided more land for Nazi Germany. But Hitler also undertook other actions that were probably not as rational. Right? Launching war, ending up in war with France and the United Kingdom because of the attack on Poland was a problem, but that war actually went reasonably well. And perhaps that war was necessary for the carving up of Poland to take place. However, not knowing the limits of German power, Hitler decided to launch a war against the Soviet Union. Before the war against the United Kingdom on Germany's Western Front was concluded, decided to begin a war on an Eastern Front. And many realists look back at that and say, that was entirely unnecessary war. I mean, maybe the war with Poland was an unnecessary war as well, but it was a gross miscalculation on the part of Nazi Germany and of Hitler of trying to open up a second front against a territorially large, population-rich adversary. I mean, there were also sharp ideological differences that just added to it, but realists really wouldn't care too much about the ideologies of the countries. They would just look at power and they would say, look, these are two potential first-rate powers. Germany is already fighting with one. It may not be wise to attack on the other, and yet that's exactly what Hitler did. And I think, as you know, the rest is kind of history. And then to add, to the train of miscalculations, to devote significant resources toward exterminating non-combatants in the form of, among others, European Jews, to the tune of millions of European Jews, in addition to millions of others. That was a gross misallocation of resources, never mind the humanitarian components, but realists are mostly focusing on allocation of hard power, military power, and exterminating non-combatants who are not a threat to you is just a waste of power. And so that would be an example of a state that it had great power potential, but its leadership acted irrationally, did not understand the true national interest, and was unable to calibrate how much aggression it ought to use at any one time. And as a result, that power was crushed. Right? Nazi Germany, the regime is destroyed. Germany is carved up, at least until the early 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, but reunification doesn't come until the 1990s. And so Germany paid a heavy price, lost that first-tier great power status because of the irrationality of its leaders. So that might be an example, if you're trying to understand, what does rationality look like? Well, that's at least what irrationality looks like. And realists would say, don't do that. Make sure that the means and ends are connected, and that whatever you're doing relates back to some national interest that's worth expending resources for. Okay, next point on the outline here. Not all interests are equally important, and this ties into the rationality bit. Realists identify maybe a continuum of interest that states tend to have, and it runs really the range of core national interests, things that are of the utmost importance to the government, all the way down to items that are preferences. And part of the responsibility of a state's government's leadership is to be able to distinguish between those things that are kind of core national interests, things frequently worth fighting for and paying a significant amount of power to maintain, and those things that are preferences perhaps of the leadership. Things that would be nice but are not essential. If a state is unwilling to do the hard work of differentiating between them, they are running down the road of irrationality. By treating all preferences and interests alike, it will be very difficult to make prudent decisions when the time requires it. It's pretty easy to talk about a continuum of national interests in the abstract. It is very difficult to talk about them specifically, because what might be a core issue for one state may not really matter to another state. So it's hard to say that there are many categories that are always going to be core interests, or always going to be intermediate interests, or are always going to be preferences. It's going to depend on the state. It's going to depend on the circumstances surrounding the state as well. But certain states are going to have certain interests that others just can't have. And so I'll give you an example. The United States, like most other countries, considers one of its core national interests the defense of its territory and population. That other countries won't be able to attack them, attack the United States, carry out terrorist attacks, carry out conventional attacks, and so on. And we've gone to great expense to ensure that it is very difficult for the actors who would do those things to do those things. That is actually one of those criteria that's usually common to almost every other state. Unless the power differential is so great, one state is so weak while another is so strong, that the weak state just doesn't have a choice but to accept that interference, then it happens. But usually states will go to war to keep other states from harming the population in their territory. Something else the United States has done, because we have the power to do so, we've announced to the world, this is going back many presidents, that the free flow of oil around the world is a core national security interest of the United States, which is not such a coded message to the rest of the world. Don't interrupt that. If you do, those are grounds for war. You've been warned. And while this could be this was not specifically directed at any one state. This is directed at Iran. So I know that sounds to be quite a bit of a contradiction. We didn't specifically address it to Iran, but everybody knows who it's pointed at. And the issue is this. Because of Iraq, Kuwait, and the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, and the relative cheapness of transporting oil via tanker, these are the Straits of Hormuz, and this is a very narrow strip. You can see United Arab Emirates is here. You can see that, well, Oman is over on this coast. This is of interest to the Saudis, but Iran holds a lot of the east coast of the Persian Gulf, and that if Iran really wanted to mess with the global economy, they could start attacking the tanker traffic that's right here in the Persian Gulf, and that the resulting skyrocketing of oil prices would harm a lot of America's allies, and it would also slow down economic activity. I mean, the United States gets relatively little oil directly from this region, so it's not an issue that the United States was going to war to protect its oil supplies. It's really going to war. It has announced that it might be willing to go to war to keep those oil lanes open, because some of our major trading allies, such as Japan and a number of our European partners, do get oil from this part of the world. They've also diversified into other areas as well, but our trading partners' economies would tank if they didn't have access to oil for some sustained period of time. And if our trade partners' economies tank, then our economy tanks because we can't sell them stuff. We may not be able to buy stuff from them if the supplies are so scarce. And so, we've made it known it's in the national interest of the United States that there be this relatively free flow of oil. There are other choke points in global oil trade. Over here in the Gulf of Aden is one. The Straits of Malacca. You can see the Malacca Strait right here. This is another big oil route through here, and then it tends to go up into China, Japan, Korea, and so on. And those are major trading partners of the United States. And so keeping those sea lanes open is something the United States has indicated it would take a real issue if any state moved to close those off or supported other groups who might. We're strong enough to do that. Picking on no one in particular, Tanzania, Nepal, I mean, they could try to claim those things, but nobody would take those threats seriously. I mean, you got to look at who's likely to interfere. In this case, Iran, and just Iran is so much more powerful than either of them or those two combined that would be no real-world deterrent to Iran doing that. But not even other significant powers, for example, India, Turkey, just in this region, have announced such a policy that they might be willing to go to war to force open some of these sea lanes, because as powerful as they are relative to most of the countries, they have other more pressing close to home things, and they don't want to lose credibility by announcing that they have these kind of core national interests that nobody really thinks that they're going to be able to carry out. The United States can not only basically threaten that certain action takes place, but it has the military and economic capacity to make it happen. And that credibility of threat, realists argue, is what might deter states from doing things they otherwise may consider doing. So, again, the core interests of some states might be common, but then there are other states, depending on the amount of power, they're likely going to announce more core interests the more powerful they are. And states with less power generally have fewer core interests, and they have to concentrate on those things. Intermediate interests are kind of exactly what they sound like, and it's really hard to give you a generic, this is an intermediate range interest, and it will always be true. But generally, your intermediate range interests are the kind of policies that states would pursue, and if they get them, it will increase that state's power, but it's not so vital to them that they're likely going to go to war should they not get it. And again, there are instances where the two examples I'm going to give you have been treated like core national security interests, but I think that those are the exceptions. So an example of what an intermediate range interest would look like is something like a trade deal between two countries that plausibly would increase the rate of economic growth of both. For realists, that would be more power. There are reasons we'll get into why realists are skeptical that those trade deals will work, but states will pursue them if they believe it's in their own benefit. If the states view the costs of the trade deal as too high, they'll break it off, but nobody's really expected to go to war over it. No one's expecting that, because it's just not that vital. This doesn't say that states haven't gone to war for economic reasons. They have, but something like pursuit of a trade deal is usually not at the top of a country's national interest. Usually. Another example might be something like a defense pact with another country or with another coalition of countries. Again, states may pursue it if they calculate that joining the pact on balance will make them more secure than not joining it. Realists would say expect a state or states to join. If, however, they look at the pact and it doesn't look like it may actually decrease their security by tying them to a country that's likely to be at war with other powerful countries, those states may come to the conclusion it's not worth tying themselves to those countries, and the pact won't happen. In those cases, one doesn't really expect for there to be war because the negotiations over defense pact failed. So again, those are two generic intermediate range interests. States will pursue them if conditions are favorable. If they're not, then states will abandon them. Usually not a cause for armed hostilities. And then all states have what are known as preferences. And preferences are generally beyond the reach, the ability of even the most powerful of states to implement on their own. I mean, even the United States at the height of its power, maybe in the 1990s, up to 9/11. The United States then, between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, when nobody really wanted to be an announced rival of the United States, there were lots of things we preferred that we tried to get other countries to agree to, but absent coercion, which was going to be too costly, they weren't going to agree to it. And so these are the kind of preferences for world order. And depending on a country's domestic politics, those preferences are going to change. So the United States may prefer that other countries pursue, say, democratic politics or more democratic political institutions than what they have, while also generally supporting some human rights and a small role for government to play in the economy, or a smaller role than it does. We'll just say that those are three preferences of the United States. Those are things that the United States would like to see other countries do, and certainly will rhetorically support them, and perhaps support them at very low cost. But the United States, if it's behaving rationally, realists would not expect it to sacrifice any sort of national interest or real power in order to achieve those, because achieving those things, realists argue, doesn't really make the country that much safer. It's a point that liberals are going to disagree with. And you can tell that a lot of preferences relate to world order. I'm sorry, a lot of preferences relate to domestic politics, right? Changing the domestic political systems to democratic, or the economic systems inside of countries to more open. The United States in the 1990s, as it is not today, is unlikely to prevail and coerce China or India or Russia or the EU or even other, Brazil, and probably not Argentina. I'll show you. a lot of these other countries to change their internal economies. They might be able to get a few token concessions, but they're not going to be able to do it. And the United States, even with all of its power, and close allies in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, among many others, who have pretty abysmal human rights records. And the United States, despite its economic and security relationships with these allies, has not been able to get them to liberalize their human rights record as quickly as it would like, or in some cases, not at all. And so while the United States does prefer that those things happen, you can see that when the cost of getting them, perhaps pushing, I'm just making this up, pushing the Saudis too quickly on the human rights issue may push the Saudis towards Russia. And Russia has bigger fish to fry. I mean, its preferences for Saudi Arabia's internal politics are not as important, but would more or less take Saudi Arabia as they are. And so the United States, rather than risk losing an important geostrategic and economic ally in the Saudis, pushes as lightly as, or as hard as it can, which is pretty lightly, to try to get the Saudis to reform themselves. But it is a preference. As we push the Chinese, as we push North Koreans, as we push others, frequently with no success or very little success. But other countries have their preferences too. Monarchies prefer more monarchy. Countries with abysmal human rights records prefer to talk about state sovereignty and the inability of states to interfere in other countries' domestic politics. And yet, not even China, power that it is, and the strong rhetorical champion of state sovereignty, it's not really able to help many states be sovereign that are not already so. It's beyond their significant resources to achieve. But if they happen, it's a fortuitous occurrence, but really no state, at least as far as we've been able to see, has the power to realize these preferences for world order. All right, back to our list here of, our outline of the lecture. So we've already gone through the hierarchy of interests. Not all interests are equally important. But now, what won't protect a state? Back on our map here, we're reminded the world's a big place, got a lot of countries. CIA, the American CIA, calculates something approaching 200 distinct political entities out there that we might call countries or states. And we've talked a little bit about what national interests could be. Could be defense of territory, could be economic control of particular natural resources. National interests might be things like control of certain trade routes. I think that as generalities go, those are pretty much it. What you'll notice about some of those is that there are a lot of states out there, and that several of these things are indivisible. That is, they can't be shared, they can't be carved up, or if they can be, there's a real potential for conflict over who gets what out of the carve-up. So, for example, two countries may have competition over a particular area because it may be rich in oil. We can actually go with real-world example. We don't have to just stay in hypotheticals. But back in the 1990s, this came out of events in the late 80s. But Saddam Hussein, who was in power in Iraq, wanted to attack, annex, and in his view, reabsorb Kuwait into Iraq. Kuwait, a number of things. It has a significant amount of oil and a relatively small population. It also was owed a lot of money by the Iraqis, and many speculate that part of the reason for the attack on Kuwait was to wipe out that part of Iraq's debt to Kuwait. But the point I'm trying to make is that the control of those oil fields is something that whoever owns them is going to have a valuable natural resource. If you look at most militaries today, who knows what the future holds, they're incredibly reliant on fossil fuels, including oil, and that there is no imminent change that's likely to get them off those fossil fuels. So it's not just about the domestic economy, but it's also about controlling the resources that are necessary for militaries to function. If one country owns an oil field, that means another does not. It's not something that could be shared. And I'm not talking about private business deals about leasing or licensing, subcontracting, and all the rest of that. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about control of territories as well as the resources that are on or under them. In the case of Saddam Hussein and the Kuwaiti attack, Saddam Hussein wanted what Kuwait had, and the United States, Saudi Arabia, and much of the rest of the world didn't want him to have it. And it came down to a test of arms to see whether it would happen. Iraq invaded first. The United States established a coalition to repel them, and it was eventually repelled, and Kuwait's sovereignty was restored with that outside help. Why did things go that way? Well, there was a conflict over this national interest, control of oil. It was important to a number of actors: Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and others. And they couldn't agree peacefully on how to distribute that, and so it came down to a test of arms. And while Iraq initially won over its much weaker neighbor Kuwait, the United States, a power from halfway around the world, was still more powerful in this neighborhood, along with its allies, than Iraq. From this example and countless others in history, we can zoom out here. We don't have to be stuck in here on that map. Realists point out that relying on appeals to principles, international law, more recently international organizations, in the kind of situations I just described to you, all those appeals happened. Legal points were raised that what Iraq was doing was wrong. Iraq, of course, defended itself and claimed historical reasons why it ought to have Kuwait. And so, because there is no government above these governments that has the power to enforce its decisions, you do have organizations like the International Court of Justice, and they'll issue opinions, but they have no power to enforce them. The enforcement is effectively self-executing. And so if states don't want to go through the international legal process, they just ignore it, and there are no penalties. So then what happens? Well, then you end up getting into armed conflict, which is what realists say is frequently what happens in these kinds of cases. Things are determined not by the balance of right and wrong on some sort of moral scale, but by the balance of military power in a particular area. So you can't look to international law. Realists will remind you that every victim of international aggression will remind you of that. You can, cite all the pieces of paper and all the legal decisions to the contrary that say, you shouldn't be attacked, but you've been attacked. You're already beyond that. and wishing that you weren't isn't going to change the state of things. So international law is not going to work. In the case of Iraq and Kuwait and the 1990-1991 operations, it's tempting to say that the international organization, the United Nations, worked because the United States decided to go through the United Nations and get Security Council resolutions that identified Iraq as the aggressor and approved a range of actions that would restore Kuwait's sovereignty. Realists would say that, well, the United States did those things, but it didn't have to. And in the end, the United States was putting troops in Saudi Arabia and was going to attack Iraq, regardless of the outcome of the United Nations. But to get back to the point I made a little bit earlier about international organizations, for realists, international organizations, no matter what they call themselves, they tend to reflect rather than restrain great powers and the distribution of power in the international system. That is to say, the countries that are powerful outside of the UN are also the ones that tend to be powerful inside of it. And they tend to craft rules that reinforce that power and maintain the status quo rather than challenging it. And so, realist explanation of the specific case of, say, Iraq and Kuwait, again, they're not really trying to describe that necessarily, they're just trying to describe how things happened, would be the United States could afford to go through the UN because it was much more powerful and influential there than Iraq was. Iraq was a country that had very little sympathy for it. And much of the rest of the world saw that the United States was determined to use military force if it had to. And nobody wanted to get in the way of the United States. And so, of course, the outcome of the UN was favorable to the United States because that was just reflective of what was happening in the real world and the real military balance of power. If you'd like to go a little bit further back in history, you can look at the predecessor to the United Nations, which was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations' purpose was to prevent World War II. Obviously, it failed. If it had succeeded, there wouldn't have been a Second World War. But there was a case of an organization that actually had a fairly clear mission. It had some great power support, and yet it was ultimately unable to achieve its objective. You could appeal to the League of Nations all you wanted in September of 1939, but the fact remained, if you were in Poland, that Germany and the Soviet Union had attacked you. And asking the League to do something in the end didn't do anything. The reason is, as realists point out, is that international organizations are frequently created by great powers to serve great power interests, and the rules inside of those organizations are not going to be friendly to those who don't want to do those things. And if international organizations, say, do rule against or decide against great powers can just ignore them, because none of these organizations have the military power to coerce states to behave in certain ways. So, aggression happens. For that, you can rely on history. Who started it? Who's the real aggressor? That is almost never going to be solved in the moment. It's just enough to know that aggression has happened by at least one side, and that a test of arms is going to decide who ends up winning. And no amount of international law or intergovernmental organizations is going to stop great powers from doing that with one another and with lesser powers. So if international law and international organizations aren't going to protect you as a state, is there any way to protect yourself in this world? It has what some have referred to as the global 911 problem. In the United States right now, an emergency, you dial 911, and there's some sort of emergency response that exists inside of a state. At the international level, there is no global 911 system that presidents, prime ministers, kings, and others can call if their state is the victim of aggression. Right? The individual in the state can do it. You can call the police, but you can't do that at the international level. So is there any way to deal with the threat of aggression and also to protect one's national interests? Here, realists are somewhat optimistic. I think that they often get painted as real pessimists. I don't think that the theory is as pessimistic as maybe some of the people who actively promote it, or of those who attack it. Realists believe that war is kind of always in the background of what's going on in global politics. The threat of war looms large, but that doesn't necessarily mean that war is always happening, and that there are ways to limit the likelihood of aggression, and at the very least for a state to keep from being conquered by others. It comes down to what's known as balancing or maintaining the balance of power. And there are two ways that states can go about trying to balance power. We'll go back to the map just so you can maybe think through some of these combinations, perhaps at different points in time. But a state who feels that it's under threat from some other state or coalitions of states can do two things to make itself more secure. One, it can increase its own military capabilities. It can purchase more weapons. That's certainly one way to do it. This gives it more that military power that realists believe is necessary for a state to help themselves not be victims of aggression, and to defend themselves if they are. The other route that states may go is to seek out allies who also have some military power of their own. And states can do both. There's not usually a reason why a state could not do one or the other. And so, for example, between the world wars, France was concerned, okay, so this was not the size of Germany then, but France was concerned about the regrowth of German power. The United Kingdom would not give the French a firm commitment to fight with them. And so what France did, in addition to, well, this is now prepping for World War II, builds a Maginot Line, but it also reaches, it doesn't exist anymore, but there's an entity over here, Czechoslovakia. And so it reached defense agreements with some of Germany's weaker neighbors that if any of them were attacked, they would all go to war with Germany. That was a way of both internally strengthening as well as externally balancing against what the French perceived as the German threat going into World War II. How do you know where the next threat is coming from? Who is it that is truly a threat to your interests? And there are two ways that one can look at this. One is to look at a state's capabilities, and the other is to look at their intentions. Capabilities are what can you do, and intentions are with what you can do. Right? We're talking about intention. What are you going to do with it? Realists say that prudent leaders, rational leaders, will balance against capabilities. And the reason why is that capabilities are in the end what may lead you to lose. Right? You just don't have the military capability to compete with those who wish to do you aggression. And that capabilities are relatively knowable. Right? That's why states spy on one another, as they want to find out what can they do. Push comes to shove. Capabilities. Intentions are much more flexible and are frequently much harder to figure out. When a state undertakes a military modernization program, are they doing it for defensive reasons? Do they feel threatened and that they need to do this to protect themselves? Or are they undertaking this military buildup in preparation for aggression? The point that realists make is that it's really, really hard to know the answer to that question. It's really easier to find out what they can do, they is just being any of your rivals, rather than what they intend to do. And the other point that realists make is even if you could figure out with 100% certainty what a group of leaders intends to do one moment, their intentions may change down the road. And realists also point out that frequently changes in capabilities lead to changes in intention. Right? If you're a middle power, my guess is you're mostly thinking about playing defense and preserving what you have against more powerful neighbors, rivals, and so on. Once you've accumulated those significant capabilities, you may stop thinking of so much defense and might start thinking a little bit more offense. All right, so you have some territorial disputes. Maybe there's some oil, gas deposits, freshwater resources, farmland, other natural resources in the ground. With some of your neighbors, you might start using some of those capabilities that 20 years ago you intended only to have for your own national defense. But now, your rationalization will change. You'll probably still frame it in defensive reasons. That, we've suffered this injustice for so long, but we're going to finally assert our rights now that we're strong enough. Realists say, look, this is just what states do. Right? That get past all the rhetoric and the talk, and in the end, states are going to try to get more power to help them get more power, and so on. Right? Power kind of begets power. And that states ought to balance against those states with the most power, because those are the states that are most likely to be able to do them harm. Right? One great power, one superpower is a lot more formidable a threat than 20 insignificant powers. So you balance against capability, against the most powerful actor or alliance of actors. You can't really balance against intentions because you can't really ever know them, and even if you do know them, they can change. All right, I began this lecture by giving you the heads up that I was going to be talking about the points of realism that were common to excuse me, all schools of realism, or most all schools of realism, and I've done that. The international system is anarchic. States got to look to their own defenses. Military power is really what drives a lot of politics. Economic factors do matter because large economies tend to be correlated with more capable militaries. When inevitably states pursuing their interests have conflicts with other states pursuing their interests, war doesn't have to be the answer. It can be solved in other ways, but war may well be the way that those conflicts are resolved. And when it comes to war, relying on international law and international organizations are a poor defense, not as good as hard military power for oneself, and that frequently states are best recommended to build up their own national armies for their own defense And as a perhaps corollary to that, search out allies. Allies are always less certain than your own capabilities because allies may abandon you. But they are something. That is basically true of realism at large, especially for our introductory course. But I also mentioned that there were different strands of realism, and I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them, but I think it's worth just telling you that there are kind of two big schools of thought about why global politics happens the way that it does. And the divide is between the so-called classical realists and the so-called, this is really exciting stuff, neo-realists, right? Neo is the prefix new. They're not the classical realists, they're the new realists, the neo-realists. And their understanding of why things happen the way they do is interesting point of debate, but it has consequences. This isn't just academic, like, oh, let's just think and talk about this. This all relates back to policy and what kind of policies ought states be pursuing to make things better off. For classical realists, and some people want to go back to ancient Greece and Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War and say that these guys were realists, classical realists. Well, I mean, there's no such thing as political science as we know it, anything like that, or international relations field. But yeah, I mean, some of the ideas in there are certainly consistent with classical realism. Others like to cite Machiavelli's The Prince, more recently E.H. Carr's The 20-Year Crisis, and so on. And then perhaps most importantly of all classical realists was one of the, it's actually still in circulation, is a global politics textbook by Hans Morgenthau known as Politics Among Nations. All those folks are viewed as the kind of classical realists. And for them, the reason why global politics is the way I just summarized it for you, according to Morgenthau, is because effectively states and their leaders, they act a lot like individuals. Effectively, the state has taken on characteristics of the individuals that comprise it, and they behave in very similar ways. So the other analogy I made an analogy to economics, but if you know political philosophy, and you're at least familiar with what Thomas Hobbes was getting at in his work, The Leviathan, it's really similar to what realists see going on in global politics. I mean, in Leviathan, the individual struggles, one against all, life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And that's kind of where global politics is stuck. I mean, Hobbes goes on to argue that government was a less bad alternative to anarchy. But at the international level, we haven't got there. We haven't gotten to the place of global government as being a cure better than anarchy. Nonetheless, Morgenthau and other classical realists think that the drive for power is somehow hardwired into human beings. That just like man in the state of nature with no government would do whatever he wanted, so that's how states behave in global politics, and the only rationale is to increase their power. You can decide if that's persuasive, if it's some sort of, deep-seated, I don't know if it's genetic or species-specific kind of instinct to dominate others, if for no other reason than to ensure that you're not dominated by a stronger power. Perhaps that's it. But that's the kind of origin story from classical realism about why global politics seems to play out the way it does. for the new realists, it has virtually nothing to do with the proclivities of mankind. It has everything to do with the structure of the system they're looking at. And again, the two basic structures that could be there is hierarchy. That's like a state, like a government. You have those in power at the top, and you have those below who are subject to the rules. And then you have anarchy, where there is no power at the top, and each of the participants, in this case, say states, are free to do their own thing. For neo-realists, it's just the system, man. There is no global government that can keep states in line, and so states do what they can in a system where they may well be harmed. And for neo-realists, they think that states ultimately are pursuing security. They're not necessarily trying to accumulate more power. Frequently they will. But there may be a point some neo-realists accept that the accumulation of more power will actually make them look like a threat, and so it would be better for them to not keep accumulating power so as to not turn off other states to them. Classical realists would say, no, that's ridiculous. States will just always pursue more power because that's kind of hardwired into humanity. All right, it's a difference. They do not agree on everything, and they don't have to. But there is a point of disagreement among the two schools. Next time, I see that I'm running up against the limits of my time. I am going to recap this at the beginning of the next lecture. But we also got to leave quite a bit of time for liberalism, which is our other main theory, and more frequently it's subscribed to today than realism. Liberalism is also pretty easy to understand. In some way, there are kind of fewer parts than there are in realism. We'll go to that, and I'll very briefly touch on, as time permits, the smaller theories in international relations. But I really want to make sure you get the fundamental tenets of realism and liberalism down. And then constructivism, it doesn't appeal to many students, but the students who it does appeal to, they seem to think it's actually a pretty good explanation. And actually it's better than these other two you're going to hear. So you'll get that on this will be Thursday's lecture coming up. If I don't have a chance to finish it all at the end of that lecture, then anything that's residual will be carried over to the following Monday. And at that time, we'll also begin talking about global politics in the modern era. So you have the video. This is the way we meet. So if you have any questions about anything that's in the video, remember you can always pause it and go back. And so if it's just a matter of hearing it, you can make sure that you've got it. After you've done that, though, if it still doesn't make sense, come to office hours. It's very easy to talk these things through, and it'll be much quicker than trying to do some sort of long-form email response. And so I strongly encourage you to do that. But at the very least, reach out, touch base, and make sure that you are right. If you've just joined the class, right, we are in the second week, you got to go back and you got to catch up with everything. And make sure that you are right going forward. Lectures tend to go out on Mondays and Thursdays, and that's when you should have completed the readings. And on that note, you should finish the You should do all of the readings for liberalism and the other theories before listening to Thursday's lecture. So make sure you're right for that. Let me know if you have any questions. Your first quiz is coming your way. It's coming to a Blackboard page near you soon. That's not a threat. I'm just giving you the heads up, but we are into it now. You need to make sure that you have a copy of the textbook and you are working through it, and that you're taking the information from these lectures that you should be. All right, folks, take care, and I look forward to being back in front of you Thursday.